folks, Jordan here, and before I get into the review, I figured I'd throw up a little disclaimer saying that this is by no means a visually appealing review. This is just your average Joe who's turned on his camera on his phone and started to make a review about an average Joe quality laptop. But by no means is it any kind of unprofessional review or any kind of review that will probably leave you yearning for more, although that's subjective based on who actually watches this. But I still feel that it's necessary to point this out because I know there's going to be somebody in the comment section saying, well, this looks like crap, you did a really shitty job on this review or something like that. Well, there's only so much that I can do with the equipment that I have, and also the extreme amount of background noise that keeps coming past my house every time I record, because it's just inevitable where I live. It's just not going to be avoidable. So just take it for what it is. This review is still going to go up as it sits because I promised it and I've been way overdue on it. So without further ado, let's get into the review of the Acer Aspire 3. This is the Acer Aspire 3 model A315-41-R3RF, made in early 2018. This features AMD's Ryzen mobile APU with Vega graphics at an affordable price. But is it worth it to purchase? Well, let's find out. So let's kick off this review by talking about the build of this machine. As you can see, it is made with plastic, both on the outside and the inside, pretty much plastic. It is actually a textured plastic to make itself look like brushed aluminum, and I gotta say it looks really elegant. However, it does tend to attract fingerprints, as you can clearly tell by this clip where I pan and show the fingerprints on the back cover. Same with the palm rest. It is very easy to smudge, and thus if you do plan on being a perfectionist with your computers, this is not the machine you want to buy because it does attract dust, fingerprints, skin oils, the like. This machine is very difficult to keep clean, but it looks beautiful when you do get it clean. Now, some of the specifications of this laptop include an AMD Ryzen 3 2200U mobile APU clocked at 2.5 GHz. This also has 8 GB of dual-channel DDR4 memory. It has a 1TB hard drive. It has the Radeon Vega 3 mobile GPU with 1 GB of shared video memory. And unfortunately, there's no optical drive on this laptop, which is a bit of a downer, but I can see why, because the battery is in the place of the optical drive, which makes sense because in the sense of things, well, the vent faces the back, so they can't put the battery back there if they were to make it with a removable battery. So corners had to be cut to make this design work, but ultimately in the end, I think it is fine for most people because really I don't see a hell of a lot of people using the optical drive on the laptops anymore anyway, so that really doesn't make that much of a difference. There is one USB 3.0 port on the left-hand side of this laptop in addition to an SD card slot, so that ought to appease some people, but probably not everyone. Now, I want to talk about the display next because it is a weak point of this laptop, I do admit. Now, the viewing angles are terrible. This is a cheap TN panel and it shows. But otherwise, I mean, if you're looking at it dead on, as you can probably tell in this clip, the colors are fine, the brightness is great, the sharpness is all there, but the contrast is a bit weak, and like I mentioned, the viewing angles are just purely terrible, so don't expect to buy this laptop and have a premium quality display in it. Same thing goes for the webcam. I mean, the webcam is just purely potato. And in fact, I was trying to record a video with it, and it didn't even pick up like half the audio. Take a look. So be a wait. Yeah, webcam's pretty bad, but I think we all went into that expecting this. Now I want to talk about the keyboard next because the keyboard on this laptop is actually surprisingly solid. Now I'm not going to include any like audio samples of the keyboard while I'm typing just because it's kind of pointless for a laptop keyboard, but what I will say is that it was actually surprisingly solid to type on. It was a little bit gummy at first, but you do get used to it, and when you do get used to it, it's really not all that bad to fire down some paragraphs of notes or whatever on this thing. It's actually surprisingly solid to type on. I really don't mind it. At least compared to my MacBook Pro, which doesn't have a lot of key travel, just like this Acer does, you get used to it pretty quickly, although it is by no means any kind of a professional quality keyboard. This is probably down at the bottom of the barrel, but to be fair, yes, you can type on this thing and get by with it. It does get the job done, especially if you're a student. So the sound on this laptop is a little tinny. It doesn't have a lot of dynamic range. However, it is still decently clear and loud. So here is another sample of some audio coming out of this laptop's internal speakers for your listening pleasure.
I'm like, yeah, it appears I do. And he points to the sign and he goes, this is the express lane. 8 items or less. I'm like, dude, I already paid him bagging. Like, frig off. What's going on here? Like, I could understand if I had a shopping cart with 100 items in it. Please don't do it. Please don't do it. Don't be stupid. Okay. That stupid chipmunk or squirrel. I didn't want to have to clean that off my tires. But like, I'm already bagging my. I'm like, first bag's done, second bag's almost done, and this old codger's like trying to start something, and I'm just like, what the like, huh? Did you go through your whole life by causing conflict like that, or is that just something you're doing now because you got nothing better to do with your life? Like, what's really going on here?
My apologies about the not-so-family-friendly video there, so don't mind me, but let's move on to the touchpad briefly, and I say briefly because, the clicking on this thing is horrible. It's spongy, it's hinged to go downward. The tracking on it's fine. It is a precision touchpad. It actually has some really nice drivers, but it is horrible to click. I mean, horrible. Don't use this if you plan on using it as your main input device. Use a mouse. Enough said. I will save you some stress. Especially, do not use this in games. It will not work in games very well at all. It is just horrible to click and probably not the most accurate. Speaking of games, let's transition into some gameplay, because I know a lot of people buying this were interested in seeing how well it plays games, so I did do some benchmarks. Alright, now before I begin, I wanted to mention that these clips might not be the most high quality, so my apologies for that. I did record them right on the laptop. And in addition, there's some strange GPU usage metrics. I'm not sure what's going on with that. It's like hundreds of millions of percentage, maybe even in the billions of percentages. I have no idea. I don't know what's causing that. Some kind of weird driver problem. But anyway, this game ought to look very familiar to many people. This is indeed Doom 3 BFG Edition, with an average of 55 FPS, a 1% low of 2 FPS, and a 0.1% low of 0.1 FPS. Now, this game is actually fairly graphically intensive when you turn it up, so I didn't go too crazy on the settings on this. I kind of turned the texture bias up to like maybe halfway at 1280 by 720, which is the resolution that I tested all of the games at today, is at 1280 by 720, because honestly I don't see how you're going to push 1080p out of a laptop like this, even if you have the one with a 1080p screen. But even then, you know, this game still is going to demand the crap out of this thing's GPU, and as you can see, it is very graphically intensive with all the flame effects, the bullets, the blood, everything that's going on, and this thing is pushed to its absolute limit. Although it is a fairly decently well-balanced match, as you can see, you know, despite the 200 million% GPU usage, the CPU really isn't getting pushed all that much, which is a good thing when you're playing games. You want the GPU to be using more than your CPU, because then that means you're not causing a bottleneck. But I suppose it probably still is a bottleneck in this case because of the fact that it is shared video memory for one thing, but also there's not a lot of GPU there to really spare, so it's pretty much using everything that it can. But yeah, this game pretty much pushes this thing to the absolute limits, but it actually holds up pretty well, as you can see. Next up, we have the likes of Grand Theft Auto 4. Now, this is the second most intensive game that I tried on this laptop, which is really surprising to say. Now, this game had an average of 41 FPS with a 1% low of 18 FPS and a 0.1% low of 5 FPS, which is really surprising that it actually played as well as it did. I was really expecting it to play a lot worse, but in reality, once you get all the stutters out of this game, it actually plays surprisingly well, and there's actually not a lot of stutter once you get all the initial stuttering out of the way, because of course, we all know how GTA 4 likes to stutter, and of course that is reflected inside of the FPS measures there. I did actually do a benchmark at the beginning of the game when it first loaded, so that way you could actually see how bad the stutter was. It never really did affect the gameplay all that much once you got the stuttering out of the way, and as long as you don't tweak the settings at all, it actually plays pretty reliably at around that 40 FPS figure. Of course, it does differ based on how fast you're driving in a particular vehicle or what you're actually doing in the game, but for the most part, it is possible to keep that average FPS figure, and in some cases actually hit 60, which was really surprising. You know, again, I was expecting a lot worse for a laptop at this price point, like to not even be able to touch this game. And so if it's able to actually play GTA 4 reliably well after getting all the initial stutters out of the way, that is seriously impressive, because we all know how unoptimized Grand Theft Auto 4 is. And I mean, to be fair, they have been patching the game every now and again here, you know, not because, of course, it's fixing performance, but, you know, to deal with that music thing and whatever. But maybe there's some secret optimizations being snuck in there to allow it to run a lot more comfortably on newer hardware, but I think it's just pure luck with this machine, being that it actually has enough raw graphics horsepower to pull this game through, just enough with a mix of low and medium settings at 720p to keep it playable, which again is seriously impressive. It really is impressive. But, moving on. Next up is Portal 2, maxed out settings at 720p, but in this case I think it was 1366 by 768, I can't remember. Anyway, the average is 53 FPS, and for the most part, the 1% and 0.1% lows that we're seeing here were caused by the loading screen and not by anything else, because the game for the most part, when I wasn't screen recording, of course, because when screen recording it does tend to degrade performance quite a bit. It actually played pretty much perfect 60 throughout my entire time of playing the game, and it actually stayed fairly consistent, as you know, we would expect for a Valve game. So nothing to complain about here. Although, to be fair, Portal 2 really isn't that intensive a game, at least comparative to the original, so I wasn't expecting this to suck at playing this game, but it really is interesting that it actually taxed the hardware enough to not cause a perfect 60, but oh well. Next up is 2013's Tomb Raider with an average of 52 FPS, a 1% low of 30 FPS, and a 0.1% low of 5 FPS. And you can see those crazy figures again on the screen there before I hid them. Now, one thing I will say about this game that I noticed was kind of odd is when we had it in full screen and the screen decided it wanted to go blue on me. I'm not sure what was going on with that. This is a problem that does not just affect my laptop, but also affects a bunch of mobile Ryzen laptops in general, because for some reason it seems like whenever you full screen a game, it tends to make the screen go funky, or at least in my case it went blue. In some cases we had other people's machines that turned into LSD or something like that, so I had to actually record this in a window instead of in full screen, because I just couldn't get it to play in a full screen without everything turning blue, because, well, we can't just have a blue benchmark now, could we? I don't even know if it would show up on the screen if it was blue or not, or actually show in color or not. At least on my end it looked blue. Now, actual gameplay, instead of the benchmark figures that everybody typically uses, it actually seems to work pretty well. As you can see that the FPS marks stay above, you know, in the high 40s to low 50s. That's about where they stay. There are some fluctuation every now and again between, you know, the low 40s, high 30s, that sort of thing, depending on what's going on the screen. But for the most part, this game stays well composed, and it's very playable on this laptop with the medium preset at 720p. If I were to push it to the high preset, you'd probably see a closer to 30 experience, but more stutter would be introduced, and I think the reason why the stutter creeps in is because it's hitting the maximum VRAM limit of about 1 gig. So that's probably why that starts to creep in. So leaving it at medium is about where you're likely to see the best performance out of a laptop like this. And finally, for the most intensive game on the list, we have Sleeping Dogs Definitive Edition. Now, this game, it played the worst out of all of them, although really it wasn't unplayable with the medium preset at 720p, resulting in an average FPS of 34, with a 1% low of 24 FPS and a 0.1% low of 3 FPS. This game really struggled in the combat section, as you can see here. There were some dips into the 20s, which were noticeable, but it really didn't affect the gameplay at all. I'd basically say that this is like a console port, or console-rated FPS, if you want to put it that way, like Xbox 360 level or something, while probably still giving it a slight bit more fidelity than that particular release. But still, this game absolutely, without a doubt, pushed this laptop to its absolute limit. And it's very clear at this beginning stage that the combat was just intense on this laptop. But in the scheme of things, if I were to rate this laptop's playability with this game, I'd say it's absolutely playable. It might be worth cranking the settings down to low before you actually try to get into these combat sections, because you can really tell in this scene And it was also reflected when I was playing without the screen recording that it was very hard to get this combat down to a T when the FPS was fluctuating all over the place with all the characters on screen and all the physics going on. It absolutely just struggled at doing this, but at the same time, you know, my gameplay is horrible, so I guess I shouldn't be really complaining about the game too much if I can't even play it. But to put it this way, the laptop is capable of playing this game, but don't expect any kind of amazing metrics out of it. Now, some people wanted to know about battery life, and needless to say, the battery life on this laptop is not great, but I suppose it should be as to be expected for a budget laptop, where about daily use was about 3.5 hours, give or take, of mixed usage, and playing games do expect it to last under an hour because the battery is physically small for one thing, and two, you really shouldn't be gaming on a laptop on the battery anyway, so yeah, just don't. So now I guess to sum this review up, is the Acer Aspire 3 with the AMD Ryzen 3 worth it? Well, that's up to you. Now subjectively I'd say yes, because at the price that I bought this laptop at, which was $280, I do think that it is a great value for the money, given the hardware you'd be getting, which is that Ryzen 3 APU. However, I do understand the concern about things like build quality and battery life, and of course there's no solid state storage, the display quality, and so on and so forth. There's many different factors, and the fact the webcam makes you look like this. Yeah, we'll just leave it at that. But all in all, I suppose if you want a fairly inexpensive laptop that's going to do everything you need it to do on a budget, there's really nothing wrong with going with this laptop right here if you're used to using Windows 10 and you don't mind a little bit of a reduction in the build quality department in order to get where you want to go in life, I suppose. But I suppose it's really up to you in the end. I mean, I'm not saying what you can and can't buy, I'm just making a recommendation, and I think that it's a pretty solid laptop for the money. But don't buy it at its full retail price of $460. I think that's just too much.